Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star. This is Mind Your Banners for June 6th, 2024. He's Mike Niziolek from the Bloomington Herald Times. That's what I get for trying to rush through the intro. Um, Mike, not a ton to talk about. We'll probably keep it a little tighter today. Figured we'd recap Huber last week. That's always good for sort of a the almost like a fire hose of just kind of random news in football and men's basketball. We might do a little baseball at the very end. But we got to talk to both Kurt Signetti and Mike Woodson at Huber's Orchard and Winery down in Borden, as is customary around this time of year. And I guess if we start with Signetti, it seemed like a lot of what we wound up talking about is stuff we've talked about on this podcast before, but it was getting his thoughts on some of the players Indiana was able to bring in the spring, particularly D'Angelo Pons and CJ West. I know you have written about both of those players here since Huber, which was about a week ago. It's fair to say that, Signetti's not a particularly emotional person. He's not going to get super fired up, but he did not hide his optimism that both of those players can be significant impact players for Indiana's defense next season.
Yeah, I talked about in terms of D'Angelo Pons having like special qualities, when he got on campus, because he wasn't an early enrollee and he ended up starting about 3 to 4 weeks into the year. Said that he gave the team, a shot in the arm, or the defense a shot in the arm. The pass defense was really struggling, and you kind of look at the numbers. His first start, they allowed 400 yards, but after that, it was, I think, 220 a game, which was significantly lower than that first 4 week stretch. Was very effective in coverage. And he said, I love how he says at the end, well, everybody's gonna have to earn it. And it's like, well, sure, but D'Angelo Pons is gonna start for Indiana football. I think that's pretty clear. And CJ West, I think it's the same way. They haven't had a big run stopping effective pass rush defensive tackle in a while. You kind of look at the numbers and you go back, they haven't had a ton of production at that position, going back almost a decade. I think one all Big Ten selection during that time, only one that had more than 20, quarterback pressures. And now you've got guys, two of them that had that last year. And I think CJ West, size wise is just, and it gives them a boost just to have that presence in the middle, but he's very effective. Kurt Signetti called him violent. And I was reading a story about him, and he kind of, that's what he prides himself on, having that sort of mean streak and play with that violence to sort of, have an impact.
Start with Pons. There are a couple things. First of all, it was interesting to me, Signetti kind of talking about him as a bit of a change agent in that defense for JMU last season. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend I've watched every James Madison game and that I have a feel for, all the vibes around that team, whether it was competition or they got on a roll or whatever. But the idea of a player who comes in and, makes a difference that seems to sort of spider out through the whole defense is meaningful. And the other thing too, I would say is, these last couple seasons, Indiana has, if you think back to Tom Allen's best defenses in Bloomington, they had really good corner. I mean, they have really good players relative to Indiana's recent history, a lot of positions, but they had corners that could be really versatile, could play some man, could play some zone, and didn't mind being left one-on-one, whether that was outside or even, in the slot at times. It feels like Indiana's corner rotation, and I'm not trying to damn anybody with faint praise, but it feels like it has been the sum of its parts and not a lot more the last couple of years, if that makes sense. That there's not been a player that, was just so good there that you just thought, he's taking away a third of the field today. Pons, by the way, if nothing else, that is his former and now once again current head coach describes him, feels like he could be that sort of player, if that makes sense. At least, obviously, relative to adjusting to the step up from the Sun Belt to the Big Ten.
Well, yeah, it's always impressive when a player doesn't enroll early, lands a starting spot, and is effective. Especially early in the season. And so I think that speaks well to what he's able to do. Like you said, size wise, I think there's a little bit of a concern. I think he was listed at 5'9". So when you kind of talk about the jump up, talking about playing against bigger receivers, more on a more consistent basis, a little more, probably more physicality in the Big Ten in term with that. And so I think that is probably, like you said, will that take some time to get used to? Will it be as effective? Will there be a little of a drop in production? I think you can expect that, but I mean, how he adapts will kind of tell the tale. I mean, look, the room was thin to begin with, so I mean, they needed they needed somebody, and they also got Sedarius Doss as sort of like a nickel corner who's also very short, but the room looks better than it did. Especially after losing Kobe Minor. I mean, you kind of have, I think, a good starter, and then on kind of a trio guys that you kind of piece it together. You're on mute.
There we go. And you talk about West, just to kind of put a bow on that piece of things. I mean, it sounds simplistic because playing defensive tackle is never as simple as I think people want it to be. But you need guys that can command double teams. Like, defense is a numbers game in terms of, the reason you hear offensive coaches talk about, basically number of players, number of helmets, number of hats in the box, is because you're constantly trying to subtract numbers from the other side, such that you have a numbers advantage, at the line of scrimmage. And I do think Indiana's got some interesting pieces at defensive tackle. Like, you obviously have James Carpenter. Marcus Burris had some moments. Was it Tadarius Collins that we heard a fair bit about, sort of as a red shirting freshman last season? People I know who were at practice during the season said he really stood out. But you didn't have that player that is just so big and so strong, and as you said, so violent that teams really can't get away with not double teaming him, or he'll become too disruptive. Because if I mean, it sounds simplistic, but if you can occupy two with one, then there's your numbers advantage. And it, in a weird way, it almost makes Indiana have to be a little bit less creative defensively. Like, I watched them in the spring game, and they were throwing for a spring game, some fairly complex stunts and blitzes and things at times. And I was kind of surprised they were putting that stuff on film. And then I wondered if maybe they just felt like they needed to work it because they were going to have to rely on it so much, or maybe they wanted to throw in some sort of misdirection. The arrival of a player like CJ West means you may not have to do so much of that. You can pick and choose a little bit more, because at times you can just be a little bit more straightforward when you have a player that commands that kind of space and that kind of.
Yeah, and I mean, when you look at his stats in Pro Football Focus, I know is not the end all be all, but in terms of, they had him at, I think, 24 stops in the run games. Then they defined kind of stops as plays that he single handedly kind of blew up for like a, not necessarily a loss, but just no gain essentially at a minimum. And he had 24, which I think ranked like tied for ninth or in the top 15 in the country. So I mean, he's obviously a guy that can do some damage. He played well. He had sacks against Georgia and a couple of the Power Five teams that they played in their non-conference schedule. Kent State did over the last 3 years. So that's encouraging, because like we keep saying, that there is kind of a change in the level of competition. And defensive line, you saw last year with Andre Carter, it's not necessarily like right away where you can kind of pick up and be as effective and productive when you're facing that kind of competition. But I think it's encouraging for when you look at his kind of history, that he's done those kind of things against kind of the best teams that Kent State played. And I think Tadarius Collins is that defensive end, just to clarify.
I thought he was a three.
No, I think he's an edge rusher.
Oh, all right. Well, then scratch that whole thing. For some reason, I've been operating all off season under the assumption he was a three. Um, I'm ready for the season. Let's put it that way. Shifting to Mike Woodson because it really is just kind of a scattergun at these things. Sometimes there's a big piece of news. A lot of times it's just a lot of sort of little pieces of news that you pick up around the edges. It is, I think, fair to say about Woodson that he is encouraged by not just maybe the talent on his roster, but its versatility. He's got everybody in Bloomington save, I believe, Kanan Carlisle is still finishing up at Stanford because I think they're on a quarter system. So I think that if he's in Bloomington, it's very recent. Everybody else is in Bloomington. Trey Galloway's not cleared for practice for basketball activity yet. Woodson did make it sound like he thought Galloway, who had the offseason knee surgery, might be able to get back there sometime toward the end of the summer. Obviously, it'd be important to get him back on the floor. But I think it's not just the talent Woodson feels like he's got, but also the versatility and the opportunity to do different things because maybe he's given himself more options this year than he did last year. And there's a lot of different ways at which Indiana's maybe arrived at that. And there probably, have been some lessons that Woodson took out of last season and what Indiana did from a roster building perspective, particularly in the portal a year ago. But one way or the other, I think he feels very good about kind of the direction of his roster and where things stand.
Yeah, he talked about learning lessons in terms of, I think I think it was the closest he kind of came to admitted that he didn't build the roster last year very well in terms of sort of having balance and depth, and he sort of addressed that. And like you said, they got sort of multiple players at each position. I mean, they really sort of fortified it. I think it looks better on paper than it did a year ago, particularly the backcourt. And you kind of got multiple dynamic guards. Still shoot a little light on shooting, but I mean, I think you have the depth that you could survive an injury or two. And he keeps talking about Xavier Johnson, how that injury sort of derailed everything. And I mean, it did, because I mean they had no really option after that. And Trey Galloway's playing out of position. They had a true freshman trying to handle that heavy play, heavy kind of load. And so I think he kind of came close to saying, look, I'm didn't say the words I made a mistake, but definitely sort of changed up a little bit and made sure that didn't do the same thing.
I think ultimately, I don't think it's really unfair to say that essentially Woodson, that Indiana just bet on Xavier Johnson last year, and I don't even think it's necessarily really Xavier Johnson's fault. He spent, I mean, he had two different injuries that cost him time. Obviously, he did have a couple on the court incidents, but even more than that, it felt like he was fighting for a rhythm through those injuries and the corresponding layoffs that he never really found. And I know you weren't around for this, and I'd have to go back and find the numbers. He had a stretch of I want to say about a dozen games at the end of 21-22 when Woodson really put the ball screen offense in his hands, leaned on it more heavily, and Johnson was remarkable. I mean, he was outstanding. He was one of the best guards in the Big Ten for a month plus. He was key to them getting into the NCAA tournament that year. And obviously, he was at one time or another a big piece of what Indiana hoped to be last season or 2 seasons ago with Jalen Hood, kind of alongside Jalen Hood-Schifino, and then he was injured for all that season. And the bet Indiana made was on Xavier Johnson being more of the player that he was at the latter half, the latter third maybe of his first season at Indiana. And yeah, he was never really healthy. He just kept picking up issues and dealing with things that, and I mean, a lot of it was like freak injuries. Like you think about what happened to him against Iowa, like that was just not really something that was avoidable. Indiana just bet on the belief that it was going to be able to put a pretty heavy load on Xavier Johnson's shoulders, and ultimately it couldn't. And the problem with that bet was that I do think it made it harder for Indiana to engage what it considered quality guard depth in the portal because you've got Galloway back, you've got Johnson back. It's hard to sort of sell people on the idea that with two guys who've started a fair number of games in their careers and they're both really experienced, you're going to have the opportunity to win some of their minutes. I'm not saying Indiana couldn't have done things differently. I'm sure they could have, but ultimately it's kind of, Indiana took a bet last year that just didn't pay off for reasons largely outside anyone's control. I think one of the things that the roster versatility Indiana has now does is it means that we can talk about they can play big when they need to, they can play small when they need to, they can have multiple wings, whatever. What it also means in theory anyway is that particularly if you have a healthy Galloway, you've got at least three, depending on Gabe Cup's progress, four players that can run the offense with the ball in their hands for an extended period of time. Maybe not that you'd like to do that, all of them, but the point is if they have to, for whatever reason, you can put the ball in their hands and let them be kind of that lead guard. But you can also play in different ways so that if suddenly you have less guard depth, for example, you don't just look around and say, well, we don't have any other options. Now you've got some bigger wings. Maybe you go a little bit bigger. Maybe you can repurpose somebody like Luke Goody to play a little bit of the two. I don't think that's necessarily a long-term strategy, but the point is versatility gives you more options in games. It also gives you more options if for a month you have to be without a key player at one spot. And not just because if Mackenzie Mbako's hurt, then Luke Goody or Bryson Tucker can just step in and play for him, but also because if you have an injury that takes you further away from doing a certain thing, particularly offensively, you've got more options in terms of shifting and saying, well, now we're just going to change the point of attack, or somebody else is going to handle the ball, or we're going to run the offense a little bit differently to fit a lineup that leans on these different personnel. That flexibility is something that I think Woodson, should feel at least encouraged about as he kind of pulls this team together here in the summer.
Yeah, I need to, anything else stand out from his, we talked for a little while, hit on a bunch of topics. I mean, obviously hit on the roster, but hit on sort of recruiting, kind of the nature of the transfer portal. Anything else stand out from what he said, to you?
Not a ton. I mean, I do find this class interesting, and this isn't really something that, a coach A can comment on before guys are signed, and B is going to comment on because you're never going to, burn your bridges with anything. But I mean, when he was hired, it was understandably assumed that he was just going to recruit heavily, local. Basically, he's from Indianapolis. He's an IU guy. I mean, the truth was Archie Miller really did not stray from that Midwest footprint anyway. So it felt like that's kind of where Indiana's existing connections were, transitioning from the old coach to the new coach. And then Mike Woodson didn't sign anyone he didn't inherit as a player already committed to the program before he was brought in from the state of Indiana in any of his first three classes. CJ Gunn was his only in-state signing. Not that Indiana didn't pursue some other in-state players, but I don't. There's never really been a year where, I mean, to be fair, there's probably never been a year where the state's depth of talent is what it is. And when I say never been a year, like in Woodson's tenure, I don't know that the state of Indiana has had this kind of depth of high major Big Ten level talent that it has right now with Jalen Harrelson, Trent Sisley, Braylon Mullins, etc. But I also think it's just kind of interesting. And again, I'm sure Woodson will probably only address it with boilerplate and whatever, but that this is the first year where it feels like Indiana's really taken aim at a number of in-state kids, and you get the sense that they're not just players Indiana's recruiting and would happily take as commitments, but players that Indiana is saying, this is option 1A for this position in the 2025 class. And I wrote something about that, after Huber. I just think it's interesting that for whatever reason, this class has seemed to capture Woodson's attention in state in ways that previous ones had not.
But do you think, because he kind of addressed this a little bit at the end when he was talking about the high school, that, it used to be, and Indiana sort of doesn't mean to kids what it used to mean, or meant to him at least, that, and he's sort of surprised by that, that he has to sort of realize that a little bit more, maybe. But that
And
his message,
he's always said that. I mean, he's always um he has always said that, that's kind of been his line since his hiring, that idea of just like, my firm belief is that Indiana is the best option out there, and that anyone and everyone should want to play at Indiana, and that, and I mean, if you want, you can say that's naive. If you want, you can say
no, but
that's,
I found it, but I thought the second part was more interesting, that he's like, but it doesn't to kids anymore.
I mean, yeah, I guess I didn't quite take that as like, I don't want to say like literal, because he does speak his mind. Like he doesn't varnish his opinion much, Woodson.
But I guess my larger point is, do you think that, because I mean, he was so successful in the portal, and he landed where last year, that his message and his success is going to maybe just translate more to landing recruits, transfer recruits, than high school recruits?
I mean, possibly. I also think, like, I think it's important to frame this conversation by saying, like, this is a difficult circle to square across the country. Like, nobody's quite
Nobody's,
sure,
yeah,
like,
yeah,
what,
yeah.
what the alchemy is here in terms of, what's I it's sort of those things where, like, and I think everyone's ideal formula is 2 to 3 high school kids a year, and then knowing that over time guys will fall away, a couple spots for impact transfers, and then, a robust enough NIL setup to where, um in a year where maybe you lose, you need to fill like 5 or 6 spots because transfers or NBA departures or whatever, you can go be aggressive and competitive with the highest level transfers. But, number one, like, the portal's difficult because it's already difficult to sort of plan the portal because it's so uneven. Like, there are waves of guys that go in, and it will invariably be players that, that go in that you didn't maybe expect to, or you'd already taken somebody in their position, and you might have said, well, actually, we really would rather have had that guy. But then you can't, can you play the gamble of, we're not going to go heavy on this, the guards we see in here now because we think one will be in there later. So I mean, nobody really knows exactly, I think, what the best path through the portal is. And then, with all the best will in the world, I mean, I have fans who say to me, like, well, why doesn't Indiana take just some in-state kids that they know will stick around, and they can build around them, and then they can accentuate with transfers? It's like, you don't know anyone will stick around anymore.
Yeah,
Like,
I don't
you
think you can make, yeah.
you just can't. I mean, you cannot assume just because a kid grew up in a certain place, or because he agreed to a certain role when he was 17 as opposed to 19 or 20 or
Those
whatever.
are gonna be the outliers now that just end up that, like, you can't, I mean, they'll be the
I
rare
mean,
kind of breed, yeah.
there's a reason why everyone wanted to ask Matt Painter about all his roster building in the NCAA tournament, and how Purdue doesn't take many transfers. And most, a lot of guys don't. Obviously, we're recording this the day Cannon Catchings asks out of his letter of intent, but, in general at Purdue, a lot of guys don't leave. They stick around, they fill, whatever role they're asked to. Like, most programs don't work that way. And every single Final Four team had at least one transfer starting. All but one had multiple. Purdue was the only one that didn't have multiple transfers starting. And then you get into sort of the, I guess, quasi philosophical, quasi sort of talent based discussion of, which would you rather have? Boogie Fland, for example, who we saw Indiana pursue, and I know he winds up at Arkansas, but, let's say Boogie Fland opens his recruitment up the same day Miles Rice enters the portal. If you're Indiana, which one do you want? Do you want a top 20 5-star high school point guard who might be an NBA level player, in 1 or 2 years? Or do you want the reigning Pac-12 freshman of the year who's already proven that he can captain the ship for a team that wins 20 whatever games, goes to the NCAA tournament, that he can win at a high level in a high major conference? I mean, like, I don't think there's a clear answer to that. So the point is, like, it's, when you kind of talk about, like, what Woodson's philosophy should be, it's hard for me to know, like, basically where I fall on it, other than essentially almost just as simple as saying identify high school kids that you think will help you, that you think fit. Go hard after them. If you get them, great. If you don't, then you just need to have a really good, clear-eyed plan for the portal. And I think what'll be interesting, NIL is obviously a big piece of this, but we are starting to get now. It's 3 years, really, at this point of the portal as it currently exists, where NIL is legal and there are transfer exceptions. Um, we probably are starting to get to a point where, you know, I think we're only 2 or 3 years away from maybe being able to say those programs are really good at the portal. They've figured out this is how we identify the kids we need. This is what we need to get them. This is what we do on the visit. This is the message we send, the vision we sell. Maybe Indiana winds up one of those teams. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I mean, it's just like it feels so hard to have a firm opinion on roster building in college basketball right now because as a concept, it is like remarkably fluid.
Yeah, and I don't know where he fall. I mean, I think they want high school talent, obviously, but I'm curious to see how, especially if this year they're successful with all the transfers, if they just say, and a lot of these kids end up being one and dones. Obviously, Bello will be, he's out of eligibility, but in terms of just saying, like, look, maybe this is how we do this, and then we have the one slot or two slots where we kind of reserve for high school kids, and we load up every year. We grab the guys that were the player of the year in the other lower conferences, or guys that are ready to kind of bump up, and that's how we build. And like you said, it's like what's successful and what's not. It's hard to there's success stories in both, but like you said, which programs will be able to navigate that best will be the ones that succeed long term, and it'll be interesting to see if Indiana becomes a team that's more reliant by choice, not just by circumstances, which has been kind of the last 2 years they've had to do it.
I will say, I'm pretty confident that if Indiana doesn't have a top 5 NIL number nationally, it's not far off. And I think that is going to continue to help even into a revenue sharing world, because I think NIL will still exist in some form, and I think it will be concentrated even more heavily on your revenue generating programs. The idea sort of being, whatever you feel about this, the idea being that the average athlete is sort of taken care of through revenue sharing. And when you talk about like what's true NIL, the the basketball stars, the football stars, those are going to be the people with the most sort of agency in that world. And it'll be not unlike talking about professional athletes and why Patrick Mahomes has endorsement deals that, I don't know, Michael Penix, I'm just picking the Falcons quarterback, Michael Penix doesn't, because Patrick Mahomes has won his Super Bowls and been to his Pro Bowls and whatever else.
Taking shots at Penix, your Atlanta Falcons quarterback.
Well, whatever. I mean, it's better me taking shots at him than NFL defensive ends, or even to Darius Collins possibly. Close just with some quick baseball discussion. Hoosiers finished the season obviously knocked out in the Knoxville Regional. I know you covered that remotely, but we both, I think, watched a decent amount of it. I wrote something. We're talking on Thursday. I think it's going live on Friday. If not Friday, then early next week. I find it fascinating just kind of where IU baseball goes from here, because I think it's fair to say that IU baseball has kind of become the, sort of the standard bearer for a better Big Ten in baseball. Like it's, the Big Ten, it was sort of like I saw a couple of think pieces saying, oh, the Big Ten's only going to get 3 bids in the NCAA tournament this year. And I just kind of chuckled because I thought, like, when I got onto the IDS baseball beat in 2008, the Big Ten was consistently a one big league. Like it was unusual for the Big Ten to get 2 bids, much less 3, 4. We've seen 5 a couple times in the last few years. The Big Ten is, unless they change something with the schedule, and Northern baseball programs have pushed for this, and Southern baseball programs, as you would expect, have pushed back. The idea of starting the baseball calendar, 3-4 weeks later, so that Northern teams have more time on the field before the season, and then can get home games more consistently and not have to spend so much of the first, few weeks on the road chasing RPI wins. The sports power base will always be in the South, but it is worth saying one of the, if you want to call it this, quote unquote, high major conferences that was sort of historically lived above the Big Ten is now gone. Four of the teams that made that conference what it was in different ways are coming to the Big Ten. The Big Ten actually had a better year from an RPI perspective than the Pac-12 did anyway. Um, and so you have a conference that is poised to become, at least in theory, more competitive in baseball. I think a conference that may embrace some cultural changes more in line with power baseball, like a more forgiving oversign limit, which has been a problem for the Big Ten for a long time. You got a commissioner that is, very sort of receptive to and sympathetic to baseball concerns. He played baseball in college, obviously worked for Major League Baseball for a long time. And now you've got an influx of schools that are all pretty baseball minded when that are going to take it seriously. On the one hand, like the job at Indiana probably gets harder. On the other hand, it feels like the opportunity is greater. And I'm just kind of fascinated where, after this extended period of about 15 years of program building, 9 tournaments in 15 years, the trip to Omaha, 2 regionals, a super, came within an out of 2 more supers, I think 6 combined Big Ten titles in that time. You know, you've set this floor for yourself. Now the ceiling might be a little higher than it ever would have been before expansion. I'm just curious to see where Indiana baseball goes.
So, I mean, do you think the direction's pointing up, or do you think that it could be
I mean,
making?
I certainly think it's, if you want to look at recruiting rankings, like I think Perfect Game has all 3 of their next classes in the top 40 nationally, 24, 25, and 26, because recruiting in baseball does happen young. Um, it feels like there's kind of a formula there now for Jeff Mercer. Obviously, if you look at this roster, like it's not like the Big Ten used to be on this cycle of like boom and bust, where a team would get a bunch of really talented young players. They'd all come up together and then they'd all leave after their junior years. They'd have a great junior year and then they'd all leave. And the problem was the oversign rule only allowed you to oversign by 1, but it required you to oversign based on the number of seniors you were losing, not the number of juniors. So you would have teams that just could not reload as they lost talent. And one of the things that between Tracy Smith, Chris Lemonis, and now Jeff Mercer, Indiana's kind of been able to do is break that talent up enough to lose some guys, but still have a solid core and then promising young players to kind of fill in. It feels like next year that's still going to be the case. I'd be surprised, depending on maybe obviously getting some guys healthy and also potentially adding a piece or 2 in the portal. I wouldn't be surprised to see Indiana as the Big Ten favorite next season, or at least very much kind of in that conversation. So it feels like basically Indiana's as ready as it can be for a more serious Big Ten baseball landscape. And I think that I think the trajectory's pointed up. I think a more competitive league could make it harder for Indiana to sustain that, or Indiana could kind of catch that wave and wind up, riding to a place of even greater competitiveness when you are playing in a conference. The Big Ten's going to 10 series. I don't know if that was public news or not, but it's going to 30 conference games, which means in theory, if your conference is stronger, more of those conference games means more
Are they tweaking
games
the
with
tournament? Have they
good
announced how
opponents.
the
I
tournament?
don't know if they've announced the tournament. I didn't even know they were going to 10 conference games, and I don't think it had been. If it had been confirmed somewhere, I hadn't seen it. But I mean, like this was the first year I can remember the Big Ten had no teams outside the RPI top 150. Like I mean, there used to be 2 or even 3 teams at a time whose RPI was so bad, like almost just playing them was a problem. Like you almost just hoped you didn't have to play them. But even if you swept them, unless you beat them by 10 runs each time, you got nothing out of it. You might even take a little bit of an RPI hit. There were 9 Big Ten teams in the RPI top 100 at the end of the regular season, or I guess if you want to, selection Monday, if you want to say. And again, nobody outside the top 150. Now you're going to add more teams that strengthen that. So in theory, more conference games means more opportunities against, good RPI teams. It's not hard to see a path to the Big Ten becoming more of like a 5 or 6 bid league instead of a 3 or 4 bid league, which is already, had already kind of represented some growth. I think Indiana is as well positioned as anybody for that, but you got to do it nonetheless.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think all the comments that I saw, about the coverage that we did. I mean, pitching obviously stood out, and pitching depth, pitching sort of quality at the top. I mean, Connor Foley has, had a ton of talent and everything, and they've got some um, guys with stuff, but they definitely need more depth in that bullpen and sort of the starting rotation to sort of kind of compete with those top echelon programs. And I know injuries sort of derailed sort of the plans that they had. So that's sort of for the short term. You're talking about portal additions or sort of areas of need for next year. That's definitely kind of the spot where they need to sort of look at and because I think their lineup, like you said, they bring back a good chunk of that, and it's really good. So, pitching, that's kind of where the star is, I think.
We'll leave it there for now. Bit of a scattergun, mind your banners, but it is very much that time of year. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. This has been Mind Your Banners for June 6th, 2024. Thank you so much for listening. Unless there's big news, probably take a couple weeks off. I think we both got some vacation time planned. And to be honest, if there's just not a ton to talk about, we're not going to get on here and shrug our shoulders for 30 minutes. But obviously, if anything major happens, we'll pull something back around. In the meantime, indystar.com/sports, heraldtimesonline.com. You know where to find all the good stuff. Thank you so much for listening, and we will talk to you soon.